The views and opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Natural Bridges Media or KSQD's staff, volunteers, or underwriters.
Hello and welcome to Talk of the Bay. I am your host, Len B.A., and I am very pleased to have as my guest today Dr. Shepard Siegel. Shep Siegel is a descendant of oil barons and bootleggers, grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area in the midst of that whole utopian 60s thing. He was a rock and jazz musician, then educator. His first teaching assignment was with youth in lockup in the County Juvenile Detention Center, the only unmellow job in bucolic Santa Cruz, California. He earned his doctorate at UC Berkeley with studies in anthropology and special education, all the while implementing innovative internship programs for troubled and troubling youth, including those with disabilities. Siegel has over 30 publications in the education field and has been recognized for many achievements, including but not limited to awards from Forward Reviews and from the Colorado Independent Publishers Association for his 2018 book, Disruptive Play, The Trickster in Politics and Culture. Somewhere in there, he played with the jazz trio Swingmatism and the power pop band Thin Ice. While more active as a writer, Dr. Siegel sustains a wide-ranging knowledge of music and delves deeply into music's spiritual and swinging rhythms. In his 2018 book, Disruptive Play, The Trickster in Politics and Culture, he spread its message of playfulness and progressive change. Its essential follow-up is the newly released Tricking Power into Performing Acts of Love, How Tricksters Through History Have Changed the World. It explores the trickster archetype in African American culture, the female trickster, slapstick, time travel, and what vision trickster holds for us today. Shepard works hard to play with you, make you laugh, make you wonder. His favorite hobby is to be with groups of people large and small, suss out the energy, find the funny bone, and provide some of the beat to get the group rhythm to swing. Dr. Siegel has lived in the longest in Northern California and in Seattle, where he now resides. Shep Siegel, welcome to Talk of the Bay.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
You've been exploring the trickster archetype and people who have the strong trickster force among humanity as well for quite many years. And I'd say you've attempted to embody that yourself at times. But I wonder, because so many of our listeners probably have not thought about this in that framework before, if you could give us some context about what you mean by trickster and maybe acquaint us with some trickster tradition.
Absolutely. So the trickster is an archetype, and you take a look at the Jungian approach to human consciousness, you've got all kinds of archetypes. You've got the warrior and the mother and the hero and the father and the magician, the fool, the sage. There's no real consensus on exactly what the list has, but the trickster is definitely in there. And when you use the word, I think we have to do a little bit of definition because people think it's all different things, but when you say the word, all different people get different ideas. But I like to introduce it by telling a story, a trickster tale from this part of the world. I live in Seattle in the Pacific Northwest, and the trickster god here among the indigenous people is the raven. And the most well-known raven tale is a wonderful example that it also gave me the title for my new book, Tricking Power into Performing Acts of Love. So, in the beginning, the world was dark, although ravens were white, but the world itself was dark. And the sun, the moon, and the stars were held by the chief. And the chief kept them in a gunny sack in his lodge, where he lived. And the chief had a daughter. And the daughter went down to the river to get some water. And Raven, the trickster god, spotted her, he turned himself into a little speck of dirt so that when she drew water from the river, she would pick up that speck of dirt. And when she took a drink of that water, she would actually drink the speck of dirt. And that is how Raven impregnated her. So she became pregnant, and she gave birth to a little baby boy who was in reality the Raven reborn. So this little baby boy is born, and like many babies, he started crying and could not be comforted. He just kept crying and crying and crying, and as he's crying, he's pointing to the gunny sack where the chief keeps the sun, the moon, and the stars, and he won't be appeased. And finally, the daughter says to her father, the chief, give him something out of the gunny sack. Maybe that'll quiet him down. So the chief gives the little baby boy the stars, and he releases the stars into the world, and he stops crying for a little while, and then he starts again. And we go through the same thing again, and he won't be stopped. Well, the chief, really, these are the chief's prized possession. The chief represents power, and the chief doesn't want to give power up. But the baby won't stop crying. And so finally the chief relents again, a second time, and this time gives the moon to the little baby, who's really the Raven. Baby releases the moon into the world. Well, I think you know what happens next. Baby's appeased for a short while, but this time he cries louder and more obnoxiously than ever before. He's ruining the whole domestic life here, and it goes on, but the sun is absolutely the chief's prized possession and does not want to give the sun up. But it just goes on long enough that eventually the chief does relent. But what happens is, when the chief gives the sun to the little baby boy, he is transformed back into his true form as the Raven, which enrages the chief. Says, it's the Raven, I've been tricked. And the Raven does kind of like a Warner Brothers cartoon, goes, I better skedaddle, exit stage left, And so the Raven, who's white, flies out through the smoke hole in the lodge. And that's why ravens are black, because they got covered with ash when they escaped the angry chief. Raven gives the sun to the world. And if you come here and you look at the indigenous art, now this version of the tale I told you is from the Tlingit tribe. And if you ever look at the totem poles or the other indigenous artwork of the raven, you always see a little red circle in the raven's beak, and that's the sun. So the raven, as a trickster, tricks power into performing an act of love, which is giving the sun, the moon, and the stars to the world. Let me just finish it up by saying that Raven, as a trickster god, exists as far south as Northern California, all the way up the west coast to British Columbia, to Alaska, the Aleutian Islands, and even as far as Siberia, you will see raven tails. And that's one of the trickster gods that we find on our continent.
Yeah, along with coyote and hare and
absolutely
plenty of other wild characters. And it seems that every indigenous culture has some character in their traditions that really embodies the trickster.
Right.
You've talked about disruptive play in your earlier book, and you bring those themes into this as well. And I wondered if you could talk about that and maybe define what you mean by original play, cultural play, and disruptive play.
Oh, I'd be happy to. So there's a lot of really good scholarship around play and playfulness happening these days. And, there's a lot of professor types writing and publishing about it, and it's really, really good stuff. And so some of these researchers did want to come up with definitions of play, of different types of play, and they came up with 308 different forms of play. I'm going to go through
just
each
a few.
of them now.
All right, well,
I only concern myself with three, and the third one I kind of invented. But so the first one is original play, and original play I was taught by a wonderful gentleman who wrote a book called Playing by Heart. His name is Fred Donaldson, and he talks a lot about original play, which is something that all life forms. You can make the case for all life forms, from molecules and amoebas to the music of the spheres, the planets. But everything in between there, every animal, there's clear evidence that they're all playful in an original play way, except for human beings. Human beings are playful in this way in their infancy and toddler. And this is a form of loving kindness, and it's gentle, and you can actually be physically demonstrated. It's basically the physical form of original play. If you're with a very, very young child and you get a safe place, you maybe put out a mat on the floor, and it's kind of like wrestling. There's no tickling, there's no clutching, there's no biting, there's no grabbing. It is certainly not sexual, but you roll around and you wrestle. You can enter the kind of this playful state of grace. That's something that all animals do. It's certainly non-competitive. Now, right around the ages of 3, 4, and 5, we have these things called parents, and they start teaching kids, oh, you could turn that playfulness into a game. You can keep score. You can have winners and losers. You can, even if you're playing by yourself, you can have a personal best, can keep score, and run that race even faster each time. And this is cultural play. It's the play of competition. It's the play of achievement. It's play that has winners and losers. There's nothing wrong with it. You need to have cultural play. It's what makes our society work better. It's that when you need a professional, whether it's a doctor or some other kind of professional to help you with something, you want the one who has achieved well and has won the competitions and is very skilled. My only criticism, and it's a big one, is that we live in a country where cultural play has gotten way out of hand. And achievement and winning have become far much more important to people than they deserve to be, and has deprived a lot of children of the ability to still get into that sense of original play. And that you never completely lose it. It can always be reclaimed, but we don't spend enough time in that sense. And the other thing I'd say about original play is that I believe there's a cerebral analog to original play, and that this is what artists do when they play with ideas, and they're playful in their own mind, or they're playful with their paintbrush or their musical instrument or their words. And that is also connected to original play. So what do I mean by disruptive play? Disruptive play, the algebra is very simple. When you introduce original play, the play of the child, into the arenas of cultural play, which is the play of the warrior, you are disrupting the game. You're not playing the game, you're playing with the game. And It's extremely upsetting to the people. So there's a rather banal example, but it works. And those of us who are old enough to remember when there was this brief fad called streaking, and some guy would take all his clothes off and he'd be at an NFL game. So the NFL games, short of war and combat, which is the ultimate toxic form of cultural play, an NFL game is only a few steps removed from that. And this guy'd get naked and run onto an NFL field and disrupt the cultural play with his childlike playfulness of original play. That's a banal form of disruptive play. When anti-war demonstrators surround the Pentagon and levitate it 300 feet off the ground, they're introducing original play. Well, wouldn't it be funny if we could lift the Pentagon 300 feet off the ground, and whereas the Pentagon is the planetary center of the ultimate cultural play. There's more military force concentrated in the Pentagon than anywhere else on the planet. So that's cultural play, and exorcising the Pentagon and levitating it is more silly original play, and therefore it's disruptive. And that is what I mean by disruptive play. So to summarize, the original play is what the child, as an archetype, does. Cultural play is the play of the warrior archetype. And once again, this country is overly infatuated with the warrior, and we think we can solve our problems that way. And so it's not a terrible, you can't get rid of an archetype. You can't kill them. You have to have them, but it's way out of proportion. And disruptive play is what tricksters do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd say, original play happens in adult contexts, obviously playing with your children or other people's children, your grandchildren, or I've seen it, I've participated in it in forms of dance, where we actually do original play. We don't have a goal. There's no scorekeeping, but things evolve out of that kind of completely spontaneous eruption of expression, and so I really appreciate that overlay.
Len, I just have to mention there was this wonderful book some of your listeners may have read called Finite and Infinite Games by a guy named James Carse. It's kind of a classic. He wrote it in the 80s and it's never gone out of print. He died recently, and he sums it up nicely. It's the difference between playing to win or playing to keep on playing.
That's a really good distinction. If you're just tuning in, my guest is Dr. Shepard Siegel, and we are talking about his latest book, which is Tricking Power into Performing Acts of Love, How Tricksters Through History Have Changed the World. So there's something about, you discuss something in the book about the how tricksters don't define morality. It's more like they're exploring it.
Yes.
Is there a good and bad side? What's the value bringing that tricksters bring into the relationship?
This really helps lead us into a definition of tricksters, because and to speak directly to your question, because some people, it has a bad connotation, and I'm here to tell you that tricksters are not evil. But the catch is, they're not good either. They just want to have fun. And as you read trickster tales from various cultures, you find repetitions of what's known as a trickster cycle. And the beauty of the cycle, and why we can learn so much from it, is that tricksters, they just kind of stumble through the world having fun, looking to have fun, but they make mistakes all the time. They play tricks, and a lot of their tricks backfire. But eventually, they stumble into a moral dilemma where they have to make a moral decision. And so the beauty is that trickster tales, always the cycle completes with moral discovery. So the important thing I'm saying here is that morality is not learned from some minister or some religious doctrine. It's not learned from some political doctrine. It's learned through experience. And in my opinion, my assertion is that the most basic moral discovery that the trickster makes is that they're anti-war. And they're not against war because they're good and war is bad, not because war is evil. They're against war because there's nothing on this planet that is less fun than war. And tricksters just want to have fun. So war is just the opposite of fun, and it's in a toxic way. And so they don't need to have a whole doctrine in order to be anti-war. They just need to stay true to their love of fun. And that, one last thing to help your listeners out here, because I did tell you about the raven, and you got a little bit of sense of the trickery that the raven did, but you didn't really get much insight into his personality. The great, and remember, an archetype is semi-perfect, so a human being cannot be an archetype but they can aspire to it. Archetypes are semi-perfect, so they're either a god or a fictional character or even a cartoon character. So the great American trickster is Bugs Bunny. And if you ever get lost yourself and you need to get grounded in what is a trickster, may I recommend Bugs Bunny cartoons, because Bugs pretty much checks all the boxes.
Yeah, big time. And what you said too about not being motivated by, oh, I'm the best, or I'm really good, or I'm going to do good. There's a Ne Percé story. This is from the northwestern plains about Coyote. And there's an episode where all of the creatures are being swallowed up by this giant that has come into the land. And Coyote goes not so much because he wants to help everybody out, but he goes because he's lonely, because all these creatures have been swallowed and he doesn't have any company. And he also goes because he wants to show off what a smart ass he is. And so that's exactly what he does when he finally finds the giant, which he finds, incidentally, by walking into its mouth thinking that it's a cave. But once he's inside and finds all these people starving, he goes, "Why are you starving? Why don't you eat some of the stomach lining?" And he takes out his flint knife and starts cutting off stomach lining and feeding everybody. And then it's, but he's showing off. It's not that he's being, oh, look at me, I'm the great hero. He's just like, oh man, I'm too smart for this stuff. Nobody, So it's very interesting how those characters are brought to life in those stories.
That's a great story. Is that how Menudo was invented?
I do not doubt it. It's got to have its roots in there somewhere.
Wow.
Yeah,
that's a great story. I have not heard that one.
All right. Well, I studied Coyote stories back in I'll say mostly in the 90s. I'll share some with you later. But I wanted to kind of explore more this issue of the trickster in politics and culture, and how, what's the importance of understanding the trickster for us right now, because we're in times that don't seem particularly rife with humor. It's hard to have a sense of humor about what's going on. There certainly don't seem to be any tricksters right now among our political leadership, although there are plenty of them elsewhere. Why trickster? Why are you focusing on this at this time?
Right. Well, and so frankly, this has been an interest of mine from a very, very young age. And Len, you and I grew up at around the same time, and we both were part of the anti-Vietnam War movement. And I identified most with the Yippies. And I do feel that, and in my previous book, there's a whole chapter on Abbie Hoffman, and I do feel that the trickster force was very strong with him. So the influence goes way back. However, I did some other things in my life, and I didn't get around to these books until recently. Yet these are the oldest stories we know. The oldest stories known to humanity is the story of Wachunkaga, who is the trickster god of the Winnebago tribe. And it's amazing how these ancient stories are relevant today. And I believe that today's relevance is that we have become very infatuated with the warrior, and it has taken over so much of our consciousness. Quite obviously, with folks on the right, that somebody thinks it's a fashion statement to wear camo is something that I do not get. But even throughout the political spectrum, where we all feel like we're called to arms, and there are battles that we have to win and we have to fight and win. And the trickster doesn't play that game. The trickster plays with the game. As far as contemporary examples, I do think Sacha Baron Cohen, I think the force is strong with him, and a lot of what he's done through his Borat character makes a mockery of power. And when power gets out of hand, it needs to be mocked. But you talked about political leaders, Len, and it's kind of like, and at least I thought this up until very recently, that the trickster is always the guy in the cheap seats, making mockery, telling that the emperor has no clothes, and mocking power. But as I started to investigate the female in trickster tales, which is much more difficult research because the patriarchy hasn't paid as much attention to them. It's hard to find folk tales where there's a female trickster who's fully fleshed out, where you can definitively say that she fulfills them all. But if you work at it, they can be found. So the idea of trickster as a political leader is one that has emerged in, of all people, Volodymyr Zelensky, right?
Right,
and
a comedian.
Who's a comedian, and Adam Gopnik of the New Yorker. This did not appear in print, but in their online edition, and I think it's called "The Comedic Courage of Volodymyr Zelensky." And of course, the jury is still out, and he's been called to bring his warrior self to the fore. But Gopnik makes some rather amazing comparisons between the Marx Brothers and Zelensky, and that in fact Zelensky won his election, I think in 2019, by making fun of his opponent, who took his own sense of power and authority too seriously and made him a very ripe target. So Sacha Baron Cohen, Zelensky are a couple examples of what we see today, but I'm basically in agreement with you, Len, when we've talked about how, as horrific as the Vietnam War was, and how important the anti-war movement was, it was yet filled with a lot of humor and satire in the form of guerrilla theater. In fact, one of an important moment for me was when I lived in Santa Cruz, and I was an undergraduate student at UCSC, and was part of a guerrilla theater troupe. And I don't typically wear women's clothes, but for this particular production, because I had really long blonde hair, and I played Trisha Nixon in a little guerrilla theater skit that we did, and we ran into the dining rooms into what was called College 5 then. What is it, Porter College?
Yes.
And we ran into this is how we advertised the demonstrations that were going on. I of course remember my good friend Laurie Garrett, who was kind of our director and creative the showrunner of our little guerrilla theater, and that's how we would publicize the demonstrations. And I remember wearing this long satin gown and probably some makeup and playing Trisha Nixon.
Right.
Now, how did we get there? Oh, politics. Yeah, politics and tricksterism. So that was the form that it took then.
And there's that dimension too of, I remember, times that there's those classic photographs of somebody sticking a flower into the muzzle of a National Guardsman's rifle
it's iconic.
at a demonstration at the Pentagon. This is not going to stop a bullet. Anybody knows that.
Right.
But there's something about that gesture that captures so much of, like, you're just stepping out of the context. This is not a military confrontation. I'm giving you a flower.
That's right.
And that's that's pretty amazing. And that kind of energy was everywhere in that era.
Yeah, and I do think we could use some of that today. And so compared to that era I just talked about, and the guerrilla theater stuff, there's some of it today, and you see it on TV. I don't know if we see it in the streets. There's some very important demonstrations coming up. The Pussy Hat, I guess, and the first big women's march after Trump was elected was an interesting form of mockery. but I do think we need a lot more of it. And so, yeah, and there's I think we may discover some new dimensions of it as the idea of tricksters don't have gender, okay, but when you read the tales, they almost always start out as male, but it's very common in a trickster tale that they switch genders, and it isn't that interesting that gender fluidity is something we talk more about today. And if you go to these oldest stories that we even know, you get the trickster character who always, and for them, gender's a plaything. It's a way they can play tricks. It's a way they can have fun. But it raises some really, really interesting questions. And I think that the feminine side of the trickster has been undernourished historically. So as new tales are written, I think we're going to learn more. And the idea, to come back to your original point, Len, of a political leader for whom the force is strong with them, the trickster force, may become more of a possibility. And I did discover, and folks can read it in the new book, I discovered some old folk tales. The Pirate Princess of Yemen comes to mind right away, where there's a female a woman who's very clearly, the trickster force is strong with her. And spoiler alert, but at the end of the story, she becomes the ruler of a country, which you don't see that in trickster tales very much.
Right. Yeah. Although I notice in a lot of, I'll call it proto-history, there were a lot of female rulers, 2,500, 3,500, 4,500 years ago in many parts of the world. We're going to take a really short break. We'll be right back with Dr. Shepard Siegel and talking about tricksters and the trickster power in the world. So hang on. We'll be right back after this. And you're back to Talk of the Bay here on KSQD, and my guest is Dr. Shepard Siegel. He is, among other things, an educator and a writer, and we're talking about his latest book, just released, Tricking Power into Performing Acts of Love, How Tricksters Through History Have Changed the World. So, Shep, one of the things you do in the book is you direct our attention a lot to where the trickster force has come up in African tradition and African American history in terms of dealing with the oppression of being in a racist society. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of what you found that you've included in the book.
Absolutely. So I love the Raven tales and the fact of the Raven and the place where I live. I love Bugs Bunny for obvious reasons, and Wachunkaga of the Winnebago. These are favorite trickster characters of mine. But probably the one who has intrigued me the most and probably presents us with the most complexity is Eshu Elegba. And Eshu Elegba comes from West Africa, which is also where the African Americans who are the descendants of slaves, they came from West Africa, and so Eshu is short for Eshu Elegba or Elegwa. Has many names, and has infused what I like to call the Afro-Atlantic culture. So not just the southeastern United States, but Cuba, the Caribbean, and Brazil in particular come up. In Brazil, he's called Exu, it's spelled E-X-U instead of E-S-H-U, and is very political. He's there. I mean, Eshu in Brazil is there to liberate the Africans in Brazil from slavery. And if you look into voodoo or Vodun, you see Eshu is very present there. And Papa Legba, which is a name some folks might be familiar with. Papa Legba is just an Americanized version of Eshu Elegba. But I think all kinds of that part of what's the power and the magnificence of African American culture traces itself to this spirit of Eshu-Elegba having made the Middle Passage. But as we all know, the people got dispersed and separated from their tribes, and so reassembling, shall we say, this folklore figure, this demigod, was no easy task. Yet the spirit there is really strong, and we do see it in comedy too. And if you like, I can read part of the book that talks about how this spirit comes up in the humor of a black comedian, where I think the trickster force is really strong, that being Richard Pryor.
Yes, please.
Okay, so I'm going to read from the book right now, and then Len and I, we're gonna switch to a little bit of a YouTube video to show you his routine. Hard times and this dangerous, risky struggle go hand in hand with the magic of humor, the respite and finesse of not taking things too seriously, or of laughing to keep from crying. It seems that the more painful the struggle, the more uproarious the joking about it. Despair, discouragement, and the frustrations and suffering of the black experience become the stuff of the comedian's punchline. And declarations of racial pride can energize and electrify an audience. Trickster gave black America a shot at redemption, and black tricksters took it. Here's an example from Richard Pryor. We come from the first people on earth. You know, the first people on earth were black people, because anthropologists, white anthropologists, so the white people go, oh, well, it couldn't be true, you know. Yeah, Dr. Leakey and them found people remains 5 million years ago in Africa. You know them motherfuckers didn't speak French. So black people were the first people that had thought, right? We were the first ones to say, where the F am I, and how do you get to Detroit? Pryor gets deep into trickster magic. In Richard Pryor Live in Concert, taped in 1979 at the Terrace Theater in Long Beach, California. I interrupt myself here for a moment to let folks know that of the 10 attributes of the trickster, time travel is one of them. Okay? Pryor enacts getting revenge on a tree from which he had to pick a switch for his grandma to whip him with. The hilarious tale conjures the most ancient of trickster myths, those of the Winnebago god Wachunkaga, who had his own frustrating confrontations with blameful trees. Richard Pryor narrates the murder of George Floyd 40 years before it occurs. He states a raw, painful fact of racism decades before the general American population began its reckoning with it. He states truth to power in the context of a joke and the safe space that surrounds the jester comedian. He tricks power so as to psychologically and politically prepare Americans for power's act of love. Pryor describes how, in drunken anger and distress over his wife leaving him, he shot his .357 Magnum at his own car. And here's the no-joke joke. Then the police came. I went in the house, 'cause they got Magnums too. And they don't kill cars, they kill... You can guess what the next word is. Then he gets this loud applause.
All right. And we'll hear him.
Police got a chokehold they use out here, though, man. They choke niggas to death. That mean you be dead when they through. Right? Did you know that? Wait, the niggas going, yeah, we know the wife. No, I had no idea. Yeah, two grab your legs, one grab your head, it'll snap. Oh, shit, he broke. Can you break a nigger? Is it okay? Let's check the menu. Yep, page 8, you can break a nigger right there. See? Let's drag him downtown. Okay. And they got them dogs that sick on your ass, right? Them German shepherds and shit. Nasty motherfuckers, right? Some places they got them Dobermans, Doberman pinchers. Them some bad motherfuckers. They fast, too. They catch the average white boy.
And that was Richard Pryor from 1979.
So the book continues. Why does this mostly white audience laugh so loud? Not because the murder of blacks by cops is funny, but because it's so wrong. so absurdly wrong. And that's what Richard Pryor is signifying. Pryor's performing trickster magic, knowing that the laughing crowd is now with him, and that to cease such treatment of black people is the act of love Pryor is preaching. 10 years later, Spike Lee drove the point home with a graphic enactment of a chokehold murder in Do the Right Thing. Thus opens the portal, trickster enters. Says Henry Louis Gates Jr., on a deeper level, black reflections on the human condition in this land of sentimental aims and romantic dreams injected tragicomic sensibilities into the American experience. So I really believe, consciously or unconsciously, Richard Pryor was planting a seed that did not come to fruition for 40 years. But I think if you were in that audience and you're laughing your butt off, because Richard Pryor is just so funny, but then part of you's going, he just described a murder of a black person by cops. Why am I laughing? There had to be part of you that was asking that question. And so that's how the trickster plants this seed, or to use the motto of the Yes Men, tells lies in order to reveal a greater truth. And so the seed of that greater truth, the lie is that joke is funny. The greater truth is that it's not, and we need to do something about it so that stories like this are not told as being in the present day.
Yeah.
So he raised consciousness, but it took a long time.
Yeah, and
So-
only people who take it in, of course. So that's
Right.
kind of the slow, anarchic way that some of these things progress.
Exactly. Yeah. So, as far as Afro-Atlantic culture in the book, I also talk about a lot about Afrofuturism and the great jazz artist Sun Ra. And now Sun Ra was not a trickster; he was an angel. He said so himself on many occasions. But the space that Sun Ra created around himself with his band and the way they performed created the kind of permissive space where a trickster could feel safe to come out and dance and play music and have fun. And then I draw an arc up into a very recent HBO series called I May Destroy You, where once again the brilliant writer, she's I believe a Nigerian and British woman, Michaela Coel, she herself isn't a trickster, but writes about the way 30-somethings in her social group live in London, England, and it's kind of mind-blowing. And it's this trickster space, which is what I really want to get to. Len, let me just make this point that I tell stories and I talk about individual people because that's how I can connect with my readers, that we learn by telling the stories of individual people, but my intention is to spark a trickster consciousness, not for us to find a trickster hero. Like like we've said that, the beauty of tricksterism is you can mock and get rid of the bad guy without having to be the good guy. You don't need a good guy. We don't need another hero, as St. Tina Turner sings.
Yeah.
So that's the idea, is trickster consciousness. So things like Sun Ra's band, or even Burning Man in its early days, or even the San Francisco Bay Area in the 60s, and other examples around the world, many that I'm not familiar with. We can talk about trickster as a disruptive player who takes on power, but we can also be utopians, and we can talk about a society where, well, what is the trickster like when there's no bad guy to take down? That's when it really gets interesting. We don't get there too often.
Yeah. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, my hope is that we're in a moment now, as dire as our moment seems, and that our political scene seems almost tragic. Those are the times when we need the spark, we need some humor in spite of it all. And I think we're also in a time where if you bring up the topic of utopia and you want to talk about it, you don't get laughed off the stage as we used to. That I think it's a worthy topic, and so my hope is to spark conversations that we really talk about what a more ideal society would look like. And I rely a little bit on a guy named Kim Stanley Robinson, and I haven't read his stuff that much, but I've read about him, and he is the biggest selling science fiction writer today. And most science fiction is very dystopian. In order to grab you, it plays to the Western infatuation with the warrior, with the good guy and the bad guy, and that's how they suck you into the story. I've
very obsessed with apocalyptic visions, right?
Yeah, and I get bored with that, and it's much, but it's much harder to talk about utopian. But Kim Stanley Robinson in this interview says, well, I'm a utopian science fiction writer, so he writes about environmental catastrophe and how, in his fiction, people solve environmental catastrophes. And he goes, you got to understand, given the state of the world today, I've set the bar for utopia very low. He goes, anything that makes this world a little bit better, I consider utopian. So folks should not think that that it's too way out there to just talk about what is a better, you can talk about people experiencing homelessness. We've got obvious problems facing us, and we have to solve them with some immediate solutions like tiny houses, like housing folks and whatever. But we all know these are not ultimate solutions. They're Band-Aids, and we can walk and chew gum at the same time. So I like calling it the chewing gum of utopia, where we can think about we can think, okay, we need to do this for these folks today. We need to help folks and help them help themselves today. But what's it gonna be 20 years from now? And let's start talking about where we want to get. What's our North Star?
Yeah, and I loved how you wrote about the trickster isn't somebody typically that you would want to imitate, because they're the one who takes the pratfall. They're the ones who does something really embarrassing, but it's a great equalizer because they bring down those who are, artificially elevated above everybody else, to recognize, that actually, oh yeah, they're just as prone to foibles and folly as the rest of us. And I really loved how you made that clear in your description of the different trickster archetype, as it manifests in different people.
That's really well said. And in fact, that's one of the 10 attributes, is that the willingness to be humiliated, to know that humiliation is part of the risk you take when you are out there to have fun, when you play tricks. The trickster knows that some of those tricks are going to backfire. And people always want to ask me if Donald Trump is a trickster. Well, Donald Trump uses certain trickster strategies, but the force is not strong with him because he abhors being humiliated. And the true trickster, they don't go out looking, they don't want to be humiliated, but they're willing to accept that risk. And Len, I'm so glad you brought it up, because this is also why slapstick is a really important and worthy portal into tricksterism, because slapstick is all about taking away dignity. Slapstick is based on disrespect. And Charlie Chaplin famously said, look, if you're going to drop an ice cream cone from a third-story window onto somebody, don't drop it on a poor person. You will only engender sympathy from the audience. If you want people to laugh at the joke, make sure you drop that ice cream cone on a rich person.
Exactly. Yeah,
exactly.
Because that is exactly what makes us laugh. And
yes.
And it's because it's out of what I'll say in quotes, character for the person who gets the ice cream cone on their head.
Right.
Yeah. So you've you explore a lot of themes in this book, and I think we could really. I'd love to get into things like you do a chapter on Lord Buckley, who is really an incredible character, and somebody who will caricature anything and everything, and pretty interesting character. I like how you said Buckley's tricksterism inspires those of us who seek to lubricate the joints of an arthritic society to make it a better, nimbler, funnier place. But it's really well said, and so I love that you bring in so many dimensions, exploring that element of how in African American tradition that humor and tricksterism has played such a part in their survival, and literally sometimes, and also emotionally and spiritually, for people to be able to see the truth exposed, where massa ain't seeing it, and that's the beauty of it. That's so powerful. I wondered, we have we have about 3-4 minutes left. I wanted to ask if you would read something from the introduction to the book. It's I think it starts on the third paragraph of page 6 and goes on to page 7. And I just thought it encapsulated so much of what you're bringing forth in the book.
Okay, so I'm gonna, starting with, let's review. So a gross simplification.
That's it.
Of our mess is that we've let other archetypes dominate cultural consciousness, a consciousness that lends itself to the accumulation and abuse of power. And by not fully exercising our playful selves, a way of living connected to nature and its amoral grace, we've wandered farther and farther away from the utopian, playful life and beautiful, peaceful planet that we were born to live in and love. We can measure that distance by what happens when playfulness enters arenas of power. When play cannot resist mocking power, when it refuses to take power seriously, the resulting fray is dangerous, formidable, and in all likelihood, bloody. Such disruptive play comes from human tricksters who were most offended by the harms of power. Like war, for example. War is power's admission of failure. Tricksters who just want to have fun discover morality when they stumble into a position of being anti-war, because war is the least fun thing that humans do. The beauty of tricksterism is that trickster can beat the bad guy without necessarily being the good guy, thus dissipating any tendencies towards hero or warrior worship, and instead opening the door to a leaderless consensus that banishes malicious evil without making any doctrinaire declaration of good. This is pretty much where art has been heading for over a century. And great art is a lot of fun. Through hapless and hilarious and morally indeterminate adventures, tricksters bent on just having fun make that journey from moral indeterminacy to moral discovery.
Yeah, I love it.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think that is like such an important understanding of kind of where we stand culturally, because we're not going to get out of the certainly out of the ecological crises we're in without a transformation of the culture itself. And you make the point that there's also a connection to nature in tricksterism, in play, really in play. And in the few minutes we still have left, I wondered if you could say a few words about that.
About our connection to nature?
Yeah, and the importance of play in that.
Yeah, I think I learned this from Fred Donaldson too, although it's kind of obvious that when you get into that truly playful state, when you're less like a so-called mature human and more like an animal, you are getting in touch with life as it exists. I'm not saying you need to go out and hunt things with your fangs and your teeth, or swing from one tree to another. But I think it just doesn't hurt. I think it's a refreshing thing, and it reminds us in a very visceral way that we are animals, and there's just things that can be learned from that. I mean, I think so-called civilization makes a big point about remarking on how far we've come from being animals. And so there's a lot of theology and political doctrine that's based on that. But rediscovering that connection, I mean, look, I can't believe we're going to end on this note, but one of the trickster attributes is they really like fart jokes and poop jokes. And if you do readings like the famous book is by Peter Stollybrass and Allen, someone last name Allen, called The Poetics of Transgression. And they talk about peasant festivals that occur all over the world, and they're revolutionary. You know, the one thing the government can't control yet anyway is your bodily functions. And so believe it or not, yeah.
Well, they're trying.
Yeah, when you have to go to the bathroom, it actually is revolutionary, and that's why in these festivals, like even Mardi Gras, where you dress up like the king, like royalty, and you make fun of them, it's part of the peasant revolution. I know I'm out of time, so I'll stop right there.
Well, and please tell our listeners how they can find out more and find your book.
Well, you got to just know how to spell my name. So I know we don't have yellow pages anymore, and even if we did, it's hard to find a shepherd. But that's how you spell it. SHEPHERD. Siegel. SIEGEL. So when in doubt, use an E. And then you go to shepherdsiegel.com, and I'll direct you to an independent bookstore in your zip code, so we can support independent bookstores. And I would really love it if your listeners would take me up on the offer, because I'm about getting the message out and supporting independent bookstores while I'm doing it.
Great. Shep Siegel, it's been a total delight. Thank you so much for being on Talk of the Bay.
Thank you, Len.